Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last webinar of the year on the practical implications of becoming a South African non-tax resident. This is a follow-up to our previous immigration webinar and aims to delve more into the technical details of the tax exit process. This is such an important topic for financial advisors to understand, which I'm so looking forward to sharing with you. And I hope you'll all get a lot of value from your time with us today. I'm Jennifer Anderson from INN8, and today I'm joined by Kobus Kruger, the co-author of the book, The Practical Guide to Offshore Investments. Kobus is an absolute wealth of knowledge on offshore, and we're very, very grateful to have him here with us today to get his insights. Kobus, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to chat to you.
Let's get started with some housekeeping. So details on CPD points for the session will be confirmed afterwards, and we'll also share these slides after the session for any of those of you who want to go through them again, and we'll share them, etc. And as always, we're very happy to take questions via the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many of those as we have time for at the end of the session. All right, Kobus, before we get into today's topic, could you give us a brief overview of what the Practical Guide to Offshore Investing is all about, and if it's something that you think it's useful for advisors to keep a copy of?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Yeah, I think, it's a book that's been around actually for a long time. I'm going to give away my age a little bit. I've been involved in the industry since the mid-90s when the first relaxation was announced, and the book was then published for some time. And then there was an hiatus, and we brought it back about 3 years ago. The book actually, despite its title, doesn't talk much about actual investments. So which funds, which shares, et cetera, but it deals with everything else around it. And the advisors out there will know that, when clients invest money directly overseas, South African clients, there's a lot of things to consider, none more so than tax and exchange control, which is one of the topics we're going to be talking about today. So I find the book, it's not bedtime reading, right? It's quite a thick book. There's a lot on tax in it, so it's not something you lie in bed and read, but it's a very nice guide to refer to. So it's something that you need on your desk, or if you want the electronic copy on your PC, and it's like a reference guide. So that if, not everybody deals with this stuff every day, and so it's just a nice way to remind yourself. And on immigration specifically, the topic we're going to talk about today, there's a brand new chapter in with lots of tables that summarizes what is applicable, what is not, what are the various regimes, and so on and so forth. So I think it's something that is a very useful tool.
Yeah, certainly sounds like it. Thank you. And right, if we get into the detail now, what is the key thing from a financial perspective that advisors should be telling their clients who are thinking about immigrating?
Yeah, Jen, I think it's actually very generic. And that is that, you have to plan. You have to plan in advance. And to enable you to plan, you need advice. Because, there's a lot of different things to consider. Every person's circumstances are unique. And therefore, allowing enough time and planning well in advance is absolutely key. So if there's one thing the advisors take away today is this: try and have these conversations with your clients, and understanding their future plans well in advance, and bring in an expert. There is no way that, we can all know everything about everything. There's a lot of nuances, and there's a lot of different, because it's changed so much. There's people that fall in different regimes, and some of the old rules are still applicable to some people that have maybe left some time ago, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I can't stress enough that planning and advice is critical.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And I mean, you mentioned the old regime, and I mean, I believe there's no longer a process of formal immigration with the South African Reserve Bank. Is that correct? And can you kind of give us an overview there of what's changed, what is the new process, and how does that new process work? And I think for this, if we can maybe put up a slide, that would be a great idea.
Yeah, so that is a very important topic and point, and another key takeaway for today, and that is that this whole concept of financial immigration has become in the industry a little bit of a, let's call it even a swear word or a misnomer, because it doesn't exist anymore. And one of the key things that people I find often and advisors don't grasp is that if you've immigrated prior to the new rules, so prior March 2022, and it was a financial immigration, that was an exchange control immigration. Even if you went through that process, did not mean that you automatically became a tax non-resident. And there's a big, big difference. We know that the definition of a resident in the context of the Tax Act vis-a-vis exchange control, vis-a-vis citizenship, are very, very different things. And some of the stuff are mutually exclusive. And so a lot of people think because they left under the financial immigration regime that they automatically became tax non-residents, and that is not necessarily the case. And it gets very, very complicated because things like double taxation agreements and all these things are taken into account. The bottom line is, as of today, as of where we stand right now, it is no longer immigration process. It is becoming a tax non-resident for South African purposes. And SARS is actually very clued up on this. And there's a link that you can see there on that slide that actually gives you chapter and verse on it. So I would very strongly recommend that anybody who wants to know anything about this topic, click on that link. It's all there. It explains to you exactly what you sort of need to do. And that is, but again, to try and navigate it yourself is difficult. So I think expert advice is key. The next point is of course, then now, if you become a tax non-resident, what is this thing that everybody talks about, an exit charge or an exit fee, or, some people, I hear people are saying like, there's a 10% charge. Well,
yes,
there's not a 10%.
Common. Yeah.
There's not a 10% charge. That is just wrong. So what one must always bear in mind is that what SARS and SARB to a certain degree try and do is fit everything into well-established practices and regimes, right? Whether it's the application of the exchange control rules and regulations, or the tax rules. And so this exit charge that everybody refers to is just CGT. It's simply your CGT rate. And your CGT rate is informed by your income tax rate, as we know, and it's a percentage of that. So it differs. And so, of course, one of the things that people then try and do is to say, but what time of the year should I be immigrating? Because maybe there's a time of the year where my rate is lower than in another time and all that type of stuff. But it's a capital gains tax charge that is exactly the same as any normal capital gains tax charge for individuals. And if think about it, right, you always pay CGT at some point, at the very least the day you die, right? The day you die, we know you pay state duty and capital gains tax. There are, of course, certain exemptions and so on and so forth, which is also true for to becoming a South African non-tax resident. So, for instance, the classic one is your residential home. Your residential home has an exemption for 2 million rand. And then there's a whole lot of quirky things around it, but it is just CGT. And because what you are effectively doing is you are selling all your assets to your foreign self. Think about it in that way. You're selling all your assets to your foreign self within the existing framework, with the existing exemptions at the rate that is charged, and that is the sort of exit fee. I'm sure there'd be a lot of questions about that, but it is obviously just we're just touching on it from a high level perspective.
Sure. I mean, Kobus, you've mentioned to me in our chats how important it is if you go through that tax exit process to keep your documentation. And that's something you said that I thought was brilliant, is that the burden of proof sits on you as the taxpayer that you are a non-tax resident. You can't rely on SARS to necessarily, know that. So, I suppose that's critical in terms of this tax process as well. It's a tax, is knowing the date on which you officially have that piece of paper that says this is the date from which you're no longer a tax resident. Is that right?
I can't agree with you more, Jen, absolutely, because that is a very important date for various reasons. Don't think of if you ever want to return to South Africa, right? Let's say, because people immigrate and they come back. So that date is a critical date. But what right now, and this is quite an important point, is under the new AIT regime, where you obtain a PIN, an immigration PIN, you will get a letter. That letter is critical. If you left before this process, you need to try and obtain all the information, or you need to try and get some sort of proof if you don't have it. Sadly, if you left before and you didn't follow the processes, or even if you did financially immigrate and you got the old MP4 something form from the Financial Surveillance Department, and you are now in a process of, for instance, transferring assets outside of South Africa, I'm afraid you're potentially going to have to go through the process again, because SARS is going to ask you for documentation. And if you can't give it to them, they're going to ask you to submit all the information so that they can verify that what you're saying is true. So it's very, very important to keep record, keep everything that you have. Now it's easier because it's a little bit more formalized. But certainly for those people who've left before, quite an important thing.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, you touched on, the fact that you might need to become a non-tax resident sort of retrospectively, if you haven't done that before. Why else would you need to go through this process? So I think for a lot of people, especially if you're immigrating, it's an enormous amount of admin and stress at the best of times. Why do you have to add this to your immigration to-do list? Why not just stay a South African tax resident, even though you're living in another country?
Well, yeah, that's a discussion that always comes up. And the reality is that it depends where you go, right? In some cases, if you go to a country that has got a well-established double taxation agreement with South Africa, things are a little bit easier, but there could be quite a few significant consequences if you don't do it. And, just three topics, which I know we're going to delve into a little bit later, is if you still got retirement assets in South Africa, what does that mean? Even if you're just drawing an annuity from a living annuity or from a pension fund, what does it mean for you? And how can you make your life easier from an administrative perspective? If you own life insurance policies, or if you are the beneficiary of a life insurance policy, what does that mean? Because remember that any money that needs to be remitted overseas gets paid into a South African bank account. And from that South African bank account, you need to deal with the authorized dealer to get the money out if you're now living in, I don't know, Bali. So you can either make that process really easy for yourself and as little admin as possible, or you can make it really, really hard for yourself. So for instance, one of the practical things is changing the status of your bank account from a resident bank account to a non-resident bank account. Now, the authorized dealer is not going to change your account from a resident bank account to a non-resident bank account if you cannot submit the correct papers that informs that you are no longer a South African tax resident. And so you can make your life a lot easier by going through the formal process and getting that paperwork in place, rather than just leaving it, when you leave the country.
No, that makes sense. I think let's take this slide down. And yeah, you mentioned when you were talking there, Kobus, the impact on a South African life insurance policy when you become a non-tax resident. And I think it's so interesting. And it's these practical things when you're packing up all your bags and you're worried about selling the house and all, kids in school and all these other things. that potentially you don't think about. And you think, oh, I'll just leave my life insurance there, just in case. But what actually happens if you are a non-tax resident of South Africa and you have a South African life insurance policy? How does that work?
Okay, so I mean, obviously you can do that. That's absolutely fine. What I would highly recommend is that you contact your insurer before you leave, because insurers have a process called underwriting, and in underwriting, certain risks are considered. Now, if you're going to move from South Africa to the United Kingdom or to Australia, like you have, then maybe it's neither here nor there, and they say the country risk doesn't, play a role. But now you decide that you are immigrating to the Congo, and you're now going to be living in the Congo. Now things are a little bit different, because now the insurer needs to consider, well, is it a higher risk for me to insure this person? And therefore there could be a blanket no, we're not interested in doing that, or there could be a significant increase in the premium. You, of course, in most cases, will have to maintain a South African bank account from which you can pay the premium. And so the question is, do I keep my South African life insurance, or do I cancel it and take out new life insurance in the new place where I'm going to be? Because A, it could be cheaper. B, it would be easier to cover it off. C, if something happens to me and then money pays out to a beneficiary, which we'll touch on just now, it might be easier for the beneficiary to receive the money. That, of course, is all assuming that you are insurable, because some people leave the country when they are older. And of course, when you're older and you need to obtain new life insurance, there can be a lot of implications. A, you could be not insurable. B, it could be a lot more expensive. And then the classic trap that a lot of people fall into when they go to, especially first world countries like the United States, Australia, the UK, and certain European countries, is that those countries typically are very big on term type insurance, where in South Africa, we really sell whole of life insurance. And so term type of insurance is very different. It's for a specific term. It's typically quite a bit cheaper, but doesn't have all the bells and whistles that some of the South African policies will typically have in terms of disability and income protection and all those good things, which could be worthwhile keeping. So you can see, again, you really need to sit down, understand circumstances, understand all the nuances, get the advice, and make a calculated and considered decision before you just jump on a plane and go. And it's very often that by the time people reach financial advisors, they say, oh, by the way, we're leaving next week. Now, I mean, if you're leaving next week, sorry for you, then there's unfortunately going to be stuff that you have to backfill. And sometimes it is possible, but sometimes it creates a lot of hassle unnecessarily.
Definitely. And tell me, I think something else that's quite common is that if you have children that are living offshore, your children have left the country, they're living in the States, let's say, but they're the beneficiary on your life insurance in South Africa, and you pass away. What happens, to the benefit of that life insurance when that happens?
So yeah, there is theory and there's practice. And what I like, you can get from the title of the book as well, The Practical Guide to Offshore Investments, is I always say it's good to talk the theory, but let's just talk about the practice. So the practice is that a South African insurance company is going to pay the benefit into a South African bank account. So number one, your beneficiary needs a South African bank account. Yeah. Now, did they maintain the South African bank account? Did they not? If they did, now they need to open up a South African bank account. But you're not here. So now you need to open up a bank account. Is that bank account that you're opening up a resident bank account or a non-resident bank account? So you can see it gets very, involved. But the long story short is, and the biggest problem that I see is that some beneficiaries left some time ago, never formalized their affairs. Have a bank account, money pays into the bank account. Now they want to remit the money overseas. They have to go to the authorized dealer. What is the authorized dealer going to say? What is your tax status, Mr. Client? Oh, I'm actually still officially a South African tax resident. Right. If you're a South African tax resident, we must avail ourselves to your SDA, allowance, your 1 million rand allowance, or your foreign investment allowance, which is the 10 million. If it's less than 1 million, maybe it's not that difficult and you can get your things done. If it's more than 1 million, then of course now you have to apply for an AIT PIN. In order to apply for an AIT PIN, you need to provide 3 years balance sheet. You need to apply all the money for source of funds, source of wealth, etc., etc. And if you just left abruptly and you didn't, for instance, continue to submit your e-filing to get your South African tax affairs in order, then guess what? You're not going to get the AIT. If you can't get the AIT, how can I get the money out? So one of the things that is also a very neat solution potentially is a foreign currency denominated life insurance contract that pays out overseas. Now, I'm not here to promote anybody. Unfortunately, in South Africa, there's only one carrier that currently offers that product, but there are products. And of course, you can also obtain foreign life insurance products as a South African. It's a bit cumbersome because you have to go overseas, go and get your medicals done and so on and so forth. And then the country risk comes into play from an underwriting perspective and so on and so forth. But there are, for instance, Mauritian companies, life insurance companies that do cover South African lives. And so the benefit of that, of course, is that money is a benefit that is linked to a non-domestic policy. Non-domestic policy is not part of your South African estate. So there's a little bit of a thing there. And then the money pays out overseas to your beneficiary, to their bank account or whatever the case might be. So you circumvent all those administrative hassles. Long story short, though, is rather get your affairs in order. It's not that difficult. And then you don't have to have all this type of stuff. Or get a foreign or hard currency denominated risk product or risk solution.
I mean, that makes sense to me. And I know when you and I were chatting about this, you also made a point that, you've got to consider where your liabilities are and what currency those liabilities are in. Because if all of your liabilities are in a foreign currency, for example, you've bought a house for your kids in London, lucky kids or whatever it is, that's also something to take into account, when you're thinking about your life insurance. And also something you mentioned, which I thought was fascinating, is that life insurance is an asset, which I don't think I certainly hadn't have thought of that before. And it's quite good to diversify your assets from that perspective, as well as, from a traditional investment perspective.
Yeah, I think I think there will certainly be investment-orientated financial advisors on this call today. They will say, life insurance, we don't use that, or whatever the case might be. The bottom line is that life insurance is a very important estate planning tool, and it's a very important risk mitigant. And what is the risk that a life insurance policy covers? It's the risk of time. If your time gets cut short, you need an asset for your family. The great thing about life insurance is an asset that doesn't need time to grow, right? The minute you pay the premium and you're underwritten, it's there. So the question now is, if you are willing to jump through thousands of hoops, spend hours and hours with financial advisors, considering the advice of diversifying investments in an international context, why not do the same for such an important asset class that could be needed at any point in time? Because the one thing, as we all know, is unfortunately we will all die, and secondly, we don't know when we will die. So the point is applying those diversification principles is just sound advice, and it's good financial planning principles to apply. And of course, the asset liability matching thing is always a key thing. It's no point you sit with huge estate duty bill internationally, but you have covered that liability potentially with a rand asset. And we all know that the rand on average depreciates against the dollar and has done so at 6% per annum. So you're going to pretty much quickly run into a problem if you don't obviously are active and amend your cover and all those good things that you should be doing.
Sure. Lots of death and taxes in this webinar, my favorite.
Well, Benjamin Franklin said, right, the only thing that's certain is death and taxes. So unfortunately, that's one of those things.
Right. If we move on now to your retirement savings, which you mentioned earlier, and we have covered this briefly in other webinars, but I think it's worthwhile sort of delving in a bit deeper today. What happens to your retirement savings when you become a South African non-tax resident? And I think a lot of clients are in a position where if they are moving countries, it's an expensive exercise. And they actually want to access that retirement money as soon as possible to help them set up when they get onto the other side, which is probably not the right strategy for their retirement planning, but potentially is the only strategy they have in terms of keeping them afloat in the new country. So, I mean, can you just talk us through how do you access your retirement savings? When can you access them? How are they taxed? All of those things.
Yeah. So this is also, of course, a minefield. And we know that the rules were changed on this to coincide with basically where we've landed today, right? Which basically says the minute you become a tax non-resident, 3 years need to elapse before you can take the money. But of course, there are different permutations now because those rules are really applicable on preservation funds and living annuities, not on pension funds and provident funds. So, that's an important distinction to draw right up front. I always say the easiest way to remember it is any money that can be withdrawn can be externalized. So it's a nice little rule to just remember. Any money that can be withdrawn can be externalized. So if you take your 1/3, that money can, of course, you can obtain it and externalize it. But don't confuse the externalization with tax, because we know you pay tax. If you touch with a retirement assets, you pay tax, right? So there's nothing you can do about that. On the 1/3 basis, or if you just withdraw, you have your lifetime withdrawal, there'll be tax implications. So that you can never get away from, unfortunately. So the 3-year rule is obviously very important when it comes to retirement annuities, for instance. Yeah. And so that brings in a very interesting conundrum. What do you do? What is the advice that the advisors out there are going to give their clients? Because you are basically at a crossroads. Do you withdraw from the retirement annuity, pay the tax, and externalize if you haven't retired yet and you haven't used your one withdrawal? Or do you retire, given that you are post 55, if you are, and then put the money in a living annuity, the 2/3 that remain behind in a living annuity, because we all know that in a living annuity, Regulation 28 doesn't apply, so you can have pretty good offshore exposure. And then this is a classic that I hear from a lot of people. Yeah, I'll just do that. I'll take the third, take the money overseas, buy a living annuity, and draw it down at 17.5% over 5 years.
Yeah, that sounds sensible to me.
Big mistake, of course, because the 17.5% is proportional of what money stays behind of the 2/3. So it's going to take you a very, very, very long time to deplete that. So maybe if you really need the money, then that is not such a great strategy. Again, you can see how this is extremely focused on what is the individual's personal circumstances, what are their goals and objectives, what is it that they want to try and achieve, do they need the money, don't they need the money? But you need to really go through a very clear decision tree on this. What type of retirement money is it? Have you withdrawn before? Are there money that's available to withdraw? And then, of course, we do know, and this is a big thing that also I hear a lot, is once you have converted and you are taking an annuity from a living annuity or from a pension fund, what now? Now, the sad reality is there is nothing you can do. You can only obtain the income, pay the tax or not, and I'll come back to that now, and then use your normal routes to take the money out. So now you're back at the authorized dealer, the money gets paid into a bank account. What is your status? So you can see how these things just go circular and circular and circular, and you need to sort of solve your situations. Now, of course, under certain double taxation agreements, you can apply to SARS and obtain a tax directive on an annual basis called the RST01. And the RST01, of course, allows you to externalize some annuities free of South African tax. But it's only on the basis that you are paying tax in another jurisdiction. So if you immigrated to Mauritius, you might have a problem, because now Mauritius, you're tax-free. South Africa, your double taxation agreement doesn't cancel out, so you're going to potentially pay that income tax on the annuity that you've drawn after you've immigrated. Now, what I've seen in practice again is typically annuities from living annuities from pension funds are pretty straightforward, right? You can get the RST01 and the money flows out. Where there's often quite a lot of questions is on the living annuity. So if you've converted a living annuity and you then get the money. And it's very hard to get a straight answer on what is the solution or what is not the solution. It seems to be quite random when you make the application to SARS to get that directive. And also, it is potentially quite random from year to year. So I've seen clients who's been successful in 1 year, and then when they apply the next year, they're not successful. So yeah, that it's again just something to be very mindful of, is that once you've converted into an annuity, you're basically stuck, and then the formalization of your immigration status, your tax status is important, and the type of bank account. So that's another key thing I think people must take away from this call, is the type of bank account that you have with your authorized dealer post-immigration becomes very, very critical, because your life can either be very easy if it's a non-resident bank account, or it can be very complicated if it's a resident bank account.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, if I can sum all of that up, it's sort of conventional wisdom, I think, from an investment perspective, would say defer the tax. So keep your retirement savings invested in South Africa, and then, you know, go into the living annuity scenario, because you could pay a lot less tax. And also, you've obviously deferred the tax to allow your assets to grow, but a hell of a lot of admin if you're going to go that route. Insurers typically only want to pay into a South African bank account. They don't want to pay offshore. And I think another thing to consider, you know, is at the time that you're doing all that admin with your living annuity, you may be quite elderly at that point, and things do get more difficult and more stressful, especially with technology related things and tax and things. So really, such a difficult decision. So I think you're spot on to say it's critical that every client gets, you know, individualized advice there.
I've got another interesting one for the listeners and for you, Jen, which actually I came across just the other day. So I got asked the question, and this is very, you can see how South Africans always try and find solutions, right, to problems, is could you nominate an offshore trust as the beneficiary of an annuity, either living or fixed annuity? Because that's interesting, right? Because if you could, the person dies, the money then reverts to the offshore trust, which means the remittances can just flow overseas. Yeah. Sadly, the answer is no, you can't.
Okay.
You can't, because the foreign allowance regime is focused on individuals, right? So the problem is there is no mechanism to be able to. You can use a South African trust, of course. We know that that's a well-established principle, because there's normally natural person beneficiaries linked to a South African trust, and they South African residents, and so on and so forth. But an offshore trust, no, unfortunately you can't. So again, that unfortunately doesn't solve the problem. It was a great idea. I got quite excited about it until I started delving into it and just applying my mind. And then I quickly realized, unfortunately, both SARS and SARB have been a little bit clever there, and they understand that they're not going to allow that type of thing.
That's very interesting. And just to close off the retirement discussion before we move on, I think just worth noting, that obviously some of this is going to change when the two-pot system comes in. It's now coming in 2024 again. So we're back to 2024 after a bit of ping pong there. And obviously the retirement component of people's two-pot savings is going to be sticky. That's going to need to apply, have the 3-year rule applied to it, whereas the savings component's pretty liquid. You can take that out every tax year. So I think what we probably see a lot of now is people are in an employer fund. And when they leave the country, they just take it because they can do that. You can take a full withdrawal on resignation. Now what's going to happen is they've got this set retirement component that they can't take on resignation, which means that they can't take it when they resign and immigrate. So you're going to get a lot of people now that have to go through this 3-year rule process and the tax exit process to get to that money that wouldn't have had to necessarily do that before. So I think that's just worthwhile for our audience to note. I'm 100%. Interested in that you brought up offshore trusts because that brings us nicely onto the last product that we wanted to chat about, which is the offshore endowment. We all know trusts love to invest via an asset swap arrangement in offshore endowments. So such a popular product for South African clients who want to invest offshore. But I think what people don't think about, I certainly hadn't before, is what are the implications of holding an offshore endowment, South African offshore endowment, if you then leave the country and become a South African non-tax resident?
Yeah, so don't get me started on offshore endowments or global endowments, because that is probably the one thing that I've focused my entire career on to a certain degree. And it is a thing of beauty, right? An offshore endowment addresses so many pitfalls for a South African who wants to invest directly overseas. And it's such a great piece of financial engineering. But there are, of course, one great impediment, just as a generic comment, is that unfortunately doesn't help with estate planning, because it always remains an asset in the estate, and therefore you'd pay estate duty, just as an aside. And not a deemed asset. A lot of people make this mistake to think that an endowment is a deemed asset. That's a life insurance policy. An endowment is an actual asset because it's got a value, and therefore it's an asset in your estate, and you pay estate duty on it. You don't pay, of course, executors' fees because you can nominate a beneficiary. And the capital gains tax, that's another thing that people often miss, is the capital gains tax is already paid by the life insurer. And that's a neat link onto what we want to talk about. We must always remember that these branch endowments, or South African foreign endowments, or global endowments, or offshore endowments, are issued by South African insurance companies, branches, not subsidiaries, not separate legal entities. They're branches based in either Jersey, in the case of Liberty Life, and others, Guernsey, Isle of Man, Bermuda, and so on and so forth. Right. The bottom line is they are taxed under the 5 funds tax principle because they are South African tax residents, right? So now I become, as an individual or policyholder, a South African non-tax resident. What is the implication? Well, the implication is I will continue to suffer South African tax once I become a South African non-taxpayer, because the life insurance company is not becoming a non-South African taxpayer. You, as the individual, are becoming a South African non-taxpayer. So now you will continue to suffer that South African tax. And what's even worse is, in certain countries, they don't look favorably upon some of these investments, and they'll look through it like the South African revenue services do if you buy a similar product from a foreign life insurer, from a foreign insurer in South Africa, which is not legal, by the way, but let's say you can get hold of one. South African tax services can look through it and tax it as if it's in your own hands. So now the problem doubles up, right? Because A, you're getting taxed in the hands of the life insurer, and now you're getting taxed in your own hands. The easy solution that everybody jumps to is to say, no problem, I will just claim relief under the double taxation agreement. Sorry, no, you can't. Why? Because the tax that you're suffering, one is your own personal tax if you're a resident in a tax jurisdiction. The other is the tax of the life insurance company. It's not your tax. So you've
Yeah.
got no right to claim relief under the double taxation agreement. So you can end up in a very bad situation that you keep this global branch endowment or offshore endowment, and you end up paying double tax, which is obviously what double taxation agreements try and avoid. So what is the solution? Because it's one thing to say, what is the problem? What is the solution? The solution in an ideal world is that you need to find a similar product or convert to a similar product from a foreign insurer. Now, a lot of people say, well, why do I want to do that? Because, if there's no tax benefit, why would I do that? And so the answer to that is there's two very significant advantages that you get from a global endowment over and above the potential 5 funds tax treatment. And that is that you can nominate a beneficiary, which I referred to earlier on, which puts you outside of probate processes, the process of winding up a foreign estate, outside of probate processes. So that's a nice benefit to maintain. And the other one, which South Africans get very involved in, is what is referred to as citus tax. So we all love a direct share portfolio, especially a foreign direct share portfolio, because we want to own Apple and Tesla and Google and Netflix and all these nice things. We know, and it's well known now, that causes citus tax problems. If you wrap that portfolio in a branch endowment, it removes the citus tax risk because it's a citus tax blocker, because the asset sits on the balance sheet of the life insurance company. So all hunky-dory. Now you become a South African non-tax resident. You want to get out of the global endowment. You now put that share portfolio in your own name. Problem, probate, and citus tax problem comes right back into the fold. So you want to try and find a solution from an insurer whereby it's not South African tax, but at least you can still nominate a beneficiary and you can still be blocked against citus tax. So it, again, is a very important conversation and consideration that needs to be had in advance. Planning needs to be made, because it's not that simple to obtain one of these products, and you've got to be careful of marketing solicitation rules. Because it's all good and well to say, okay, well, that's fine. I will buy a Canada Life a bond. They refer to them as bonds overseas. So personal portfolio bond or a baby bond or whatever the case might be. But how do you get hold of the information? How do you enter into this contract, being based in South Africa, having a South African advisor that is not regulated to sell the product? Becomes very, very difficult. So yeah, again, planning very, very important, and personal circumstances depending on where you're going. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, I mean it's certainly convinced me that it's not something I would undertake without a lot of financial advice and a lot of sort of planning and discussion. It's certainly a lot of devil in the detail. And Cobus, sort of one of the last things we've probably got time for is, can we touch on whether, in your opinion, it's practically possible for a South African advisor to maintain an advice relationship with clients that are immigrating, or with clients whose kids and beneficiaries have immigrated?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic, and probably could do a 1-hour webinar on that topic. So there's one thing, right, that all immigrants do, regardless of where they are in the world, whether it's South Americans or Asians or South Africans. One thing that is consistent across the board is that immigrants always, some more regularly than others, go back to their home countries. And South Africans come back to South Africa regularly, especially over December, right? They all want to come to Cape Town, sit on Clifton Beach, etc., etc., etc. So that gives a fantastic opportunity, of course, because you could give the advice to the South African whilst he's in South Africa. So that removes a lot of issues, but you've got to be very careful, because, of course, you as a South African advisor are not necessarily, and there are very few of them. I know of a couple, but there are very few people that are licensed to give advice both in South Africa and in a foreign jurisdiction. And so you've got to be very, very careful what you do there. If you start providing advice on someone, for instance, that has immigrated to the UK on their UK assets, UK SIP, UK investment accounts, and so on and so forth, that could get quite problematic. And not so much, obviously the regulatory thing is quite important, but, are you up to speed with the latest information? You give someone the wrong advice, then there's a lot of issues around it. So I think, you've got to be very, very careful what you do, but there's nothing wrong giving South African advice on South African products in South Africa, especially on this on the soil. So that is definitely possible. And then I think, you can take that further. Is it a threat or an opportunity, the fact that South African clients are immigrating? Well, I think always in chaos, there's opportunity. So you need to find ways to upskill yourself, make sure that you have all the latest information so that you can give sound advice, and build the relationships in advance with, for instance, if you've got an elderly or reasonably elderly client in South Africa that the beneficiaries are offshore, build the relationship with those beneficiaries. You don't know whether they might come back to South Africa, whether they might want to keep money in South Africa, whether they want to keep properties in South Africa, and so on and so forth. So I think it is very possible to continue to have the relationship. I also think that, I know this for a fact, that there are a lot of South African companies, insurance, wealth management, banks, companies that are working on immigration solutions as we speak. And I think what you'll see is a lot of solutions popping out in the not too distant future, where it will be made easier for financial advisors to retain those relationships, and for those companies, because obviously those companies want to retain the assets, right? They don't want to just have the assets flow out the door. The other interesting one that I always say to people, we mustn't underestimate, is despite all South Africa's challenges, there's actually a lot of people immigrating to South Africa, right?
That's right.
And in the Cape Town and in the Western Cape, we have a lot of that, right? Lots of Brits, lots of Germans, and actually a one that is picked up quite a lot recently. And I was on a webinar the other day with Currency Partners and some other people as well, where they were saying that a lot of Americans are coming to South Africa, actually basing themselves now. With the likes of Amazon opening up offices here and those type of things, you have that type of thing. So the question I have for the financial advisors out there, is there an opportunity for you to help those clients? Because remember, just as your client that are leaving to the UK needs advice for their UK financial affairs, the foreigners that are coming here need advice for the South African financial affairs. And a lot of foreigners that come here end up buying property here. Now, the minute someone buys a property, there's a lot of opportunity, right? There's insurance, there's all sorts of things that you can get involved in. So I think we, as South Africans, sometimes we get very pessimistic and we get very down in the dumps. I suppose not just South Africans, but I think especially with some of our challenges that we face here, that we stop seeing the wood for the trees. And I always say, as I said before, in chaos, sometimes there's good opportunity, and we need to think outside the box and try and identify those opportunities and use them.
I think that's so true. And for me, when you say that, the first thing that springs to mind was lockdown, and it was awful, and there was no booze to be found anywhere, but some industries flourished. Try to go to a small little craft brewery who used to sell one make your own beer kit a year, and now they were printing money, those guys. So always an opportunity in the chaos, as you say. Last thing, Cobus, before we move to questions, and I am keeping an eye on the time, is what's the key thing that you think advisors should take away from what we've discussed today? And I think we wanted to just put up a slide for this as well. This slide is quite important. So obviously, overarchingly, still, what must I take away? Planning and advice, but also understand that, and I alluded to it right in the beginning, is that there's different regimes
And those regimes, especially from an exchange control perspective, and don't get confused between exchange control and tax residency, have different implications. And so what this little table does, it compares, if you're a South African tax resident, what are the implications with you with regards to your SDA, FIA, money that can be transferred overseas or not. And then very importantly is it distinguishes very clearly the difference between someone that formerly financially immigrated under the old regime and someone that immigrates now and becomes a South African tax non-resident. And there are slight nuances, the biggest of which is that your SDA is lost once you've become a tax non-resident. You get it in your first year, the year in which you immigrate, but post that, there is no SDA. And then comes all the issues around which we've discussed in detail. What is your bank account? Is it resident? Is it non-resident? If you obtain assets in South Africa, whether by inheritance, by beneficiary of an insurance policy or whatever the case may be, how can you remit that overseas? By the way, just a little small one that I'm just thinking about is people who are immigrating or becoming a South African tax non-resident, has a house here. He comes back here, right, and spends 3 months of a year here whilst working, being a digital nomad. You are liable for income tax in South Africa because you obtained the money whilst being based in the border of this country. So don't make that mistake to think that now that you've immigrated and become a South African tax non-resident, that you can come to South Africa and just do what you want. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. So you still have source-based.
Didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. You still have source-based income tax arrangements then in that circumstances. So those are the types of things you just need to watch. Then there's obviously the physical present tests and all those things that can be that can be applied, and that's a minefield on its own, which I'm certainly not going to cover today.
Sure. And I think this for me is so interesting and so critical, because I think when we talk about this old regime and new regime for immigrating, you sort of think about it as the event itself. It never really occurred to me, certainly, what are the downstream implications? And things like, all these really practical examples. What happens with your credit card? And you sort of think, well, I've left. The fact that I did under a different regime is immaterial now that I've gone. But you can see here from this table, just really, really practical things that if you don't know, you could really get stuck.
Yeah.
Okay, I think let's take that slide down, and we've got a few minutes left for questions. And I think if we have a ton of questions we don't get to, we can always Cobus answer them offline and send them off in a pack with the slides. Let's see here. Right, so let's start with the first question. If someone immigrated in the past but not formally, so they've just left, and now inherits assets from a deceased South African family member, what tax implications could there be in the acceptance of the inheritance, if any?
Well, so if you just left, right, and you can't prove that you're a South African non-resident, you are a South African tax resident. Now, receiving an inheritance is not necessarily a taxable event, but now you've got the money, anything that happens post-death is taxable, right? So, that's the easiest way to answer that question. But just remember, if you want to, for whatever reason, show that you're a South African tax non-resident, as we said right up front, the burden of proof is on you, not on SARS. They don't care, right? You need to show them that you're not a South African tax resident. And that can either be easy or difficult. In this case, where someone just left, well, potentially could be problematic.
Yep. Sorry, I jumped there. There was a massive bolt of lightning and a crack of thunder. So if anyone saw me doing it wasn't the shock of your answer there. And I think to add to your answer there, just thinking back to our inheritance webinar with Lauren from Currency Partners, is your South African barcoded ID is critical. So if you are overseas and you inherit money from South Africa, regardless of the tax, which is what this question was, but the process is a whole lot easier if you've got that ID. So if you've left and you've got the old blue ID, you never bothered to get a new South African ID, next time you're visiting South Africa, pop into Home Affairs. It's not that painful at the bank. Get that ID. That certainly was my takeaway from that inheritance webinar we did.
Yeah.
The next question I think is a clarification on what we said is if a client is earning an income from a living annuity, can they never close their South African tax number and therefore cannot cease to be an SA tax resident? So what if you're already earning a living annuity? I think this happens to quite a lot of people, and your kids have moved, let's say, to Australia, and you think, oh, I want to follow the kids. Can you become a non-tax resident despite the fact that you're still earning this living annuity income from a South African living annuity?
I think in theory, yes, if you're willing to leave the money behind and just let it be. In practice, no, because the problem is when you receive the income, you need to pay tax. And for you to remit it, you're going to be back at the authorized dealer who's not going to want to remit the money for you. So that's the problem that you sit with. So that's a classic example where practice and theory clashes, and where it is I don't want to give a definitive, absolutely categorically not, but from where I stand, just not having delved into the depth of it, I would say that is a good point. And actually, no, you can't, because unless you're willing, of course, to just relinquish the money, that's a different story. Then you can just go. But yeah,
I think we know many people like that.
I don't know people that hand out money for free, right?
Me neither. I think what's interesting there, because I think it's such a common situation. Your kids move overseas. It's tough there. There's no nannies. People have to, both parents have to work. So the grandparents think, oh, we're going to move over. We'll be close to the grandkids and we're going to step up and help. But you're not necessarily going to become a tax resident in this new country. You potentially, it depends what visa you're there on, and you're also not working because you're retired. So why would you become, a tax resident in the UK, etc.? So actually a really, really, really great question. So thank you so much for that question coming through. Let's see. I'm just trying to, some of these questions are quite detailed and we don't have a lot of time. This is a practical question that I'm not sure we'd be able to answer, but let's have a go. Life cover question. Some of the beneficiaries live overseas, other beneficiaries are in South Africa. Will the SA beneficiaries have to wait and not get a speed of payment for their portion of the benefit because we're waiting to pay the offshore beneficiaries? I'd imagine maybe it differs from insurer to insurer, but I mean, what's your take on that, Cobus?
Yeah, so it does differ from insurer to insurer, but I've certainly seen, look, because they pay the benefit to that individual, right? And there's nothing that stops them from paying it. So, unless there's not a South African bank, remember that the issue is not the payment of the benefit. The issue is how do you remit it overseas? So let's just assume you have someone that's based there and they have a South African bank account. They'll pay the money to the bank account. The problem, so that's got nothing to do with the other beneficiary who's still in South Africa who gets the money and can then use it. It's the problem is how do this person that's based overseas get the money through the authorized dealer from his bank account to his Australian or New Zealand bank account? That's the issue. So in most cases, I don't see a problem with the money actually physically being paid out by the life insurer. That's not the issue.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I think last question we've probably got time for, and it covers the only thing that we haven't covered. We've done death, we've done taxes, so now let's do divorce, just to make everybody's Friday extra fun. Question around divorce. If you get divorced and the non-member spouse has immigrated, can it be done, and what is the tax implication? And I presume here we're going to have to make an assumption. We're saying formally immigrated or is a non-tax resident.
So just repeat the question.
So we've got a husband and wife. They've gotten, well, maybe we're going to have to do a bit of interpretation here. So it sounds like one of the members of that couple have moved overseas and now they are getting divorced. So post the one party in the marriage becoming a non-tax resident, they are now requesting a divorce. This sounds like a nightmare to me. So you've got one SA tax res, one non-tax res, and now they're requesting a divorce.
I mean, I would refer to the normal practices, right? So if this person has left the country and they can prove that they've left the country and they are non-South African tax resident, right? By becoming a non-South African, so again, it depends on which regime, right? If they financially immigrated from an ex-con perspective, they are non-resident. So the money can flow. There's nobody at the financial services, the surveillance department will stop them, right? The money can flow from an ex-con perspective. Therefore, they must prove to SARS that they are not a tax resident. If they immigrated under the new arrangement and they are a South African tax resident, the financial services, the financial surveillance department assumes that you're also, or they recognize that you're also a non-resident from an exchange control perspective. And as long as that is in case, the money can flow. But that's got nothing to do with, the divorce decree and how stuff was paid out and all of that stuff. So I'm assuming that this person is now entitled to a payment. And the question is, can that payment flow? So the next point is okay, did you formally leave? Did you not? Under which regime? And what are the implications of it? There's a special AIT that you can obtain above the 10 million, which we're all aware of, which is quite an exercise, but but there's no special treatment, right? SARS and SARB are both going to push you to, but what does the exchange control manual say, or what does the law say? And you need to fit into one of those recognized mechanisms. If you don't fit into one of those recognized mechanisms, it becomes very, very tough. But they'll always apply those same principles, like I just tried to do here. Of course, it's very difficult if you don't have all the facts. So again, as you said, let's look at some of these more detailed questions and we can try and answer some of it. But, that's a classic example of where I would approach a professional and get proper advice on that.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think just reading through some of these questions, it just again really sort of drives it home for me that these financial advisors out there get asked everything and anything. There's no kind of this is your lane and I'll go to ask someone else. When you're someone's financial advisor, you kind of their go-to for any kind of struggle or question or worry that has to do with anything financial, which I mean is a huge responsibility. And yeah, I mean, I think it's clear from this chat today that there's just a lot of things that you need to take into account, and I think know when to call in the experts. As you say, we can't all know everything. If you at a point where you need to get help from an expert, I mean, by all means, I think that's what all of us do in any case in our day to day. I think we better leave it there. Thank you so much, Cobus. I mean, I think it's been an absolute, it feels like a roller coaster. I feel like I've already learned about 400 new things, despite the fact that we talk all the time. So I think just to close off, just to thank our audience so much for being with us. We know it's late in the year. We know you're all tired and wrapping up, as are we. So thank you for being with us today and for giving your time to us. And just to let you know that we are kicking off 2024 strongly. From the INN8 perspective, we'll be reviewing NMG's global wealth management trends as one of our first webinars of the year, as well as the first in the room, which is with Alan Gray, and that's going to be taking place in February. So Cobus, thank you. It was wonderful to have you. And thanks to our audience. Bye, everyone.
INN8 is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorised financial services provider.